Hi there, welcome back to PLS 135. I'm looking at Module C right now, um, and that's chapters 11 to 16, 42, 49, 50, 68, 69, and 70 from Hubert's Attenuated Democracy text. Um, and the theme of Module C, where do we locate our rights, is understanding the spatial dimensions and the institutional structures that define where rights are recognized, contested, and protected in the US political system. So, the question of where rights reside, places like courts, legislatures, constitutions, public spaces, matters, for how we protect those rights. Um, One example of that is in chapter 11, where Hubert notes that rights become real not just by writing them down, but by being recognized in court decisions, in police practices, and in kind of protest spaces around the U.S. Um, so, what kind of institutions do we locate our rights in? The courts is certainly where you would look to first. Courts have often become the battleground for defining what a right means in practice. And Hubert notes that in the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, there's a moment where an abstract right to equality was given concrete institutional backing. Um, and so that concrete institutional backing was by the Supreme Court voting 9-0 that segregation is inherently unequal, separate is inherently unequal. And this abstract right to equality cut down the all the laws that had been passed to support segregation since the 1890s, since 1877, but that was in 1954. Um, and so, where else do we locate our rights? Congress and the presidency is one place. Rights are also shaped by legislation and by executive action, and they often reflect public pressure and collective struggle. Chapter 14 discusses the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a pivotal moment when Congress codified protections, meaning they legalized and wrote down protections that many courts had been slow to enforce, particularly in the last 10 years. But in addition to enforced segregation that was outlawed as of 1954, the Civil Rights Act went further and clarified that public spaces, places of public accommodation, also could not discriminate. In addition to the government itself, the states and the federal government couldn't discriminate on the basis of race. Neither could places of public accommodation, saying things like "no Irish need apply" or only whites allowed. Things like that. Segregated lunch counters, that kind of thing. Um, so codified protections many courts have been slow to enforce were clarified through the Civil Rights Act. So the courts were one place where the civil rights movement had a success, but it took further legal action, institutional action by Congress and the president to actually further cement these political and cultural and social rights that were emerging as a result of pressure from the civil rights movement. Where else do we locate our rights? Federalism and fragmentation. So, federalism of the 50 states sharing power, dividing power with the federal government. The layered structure of American federalism affects where a right exists. Does it exist nationally? Does it exist in the states, or does it exist in both places? Hubert does mention that an example of cannabis and marijuana legalization reflects a tension between federal and state authority, illustrating how rights are not uniformly protected across geography and across states. So that was also a real a real, nugget of contention between states when we're talking about same-sex marriage bans in the early 2000s, and how ultimately that led to a Supreme Court case where the court decided that not only was they kind of had a two-part ruling, but one of those rulings, in addition to saying that banning marriage between people of the same sex violated the 14th Amendment, both the Equal Protection and the Due Process Clauses, but also that individual states did not have the ability to essentially legislate this for other states. And it wasn't sustainable for such a core function of democracy to be able to, in the United States, to be undermined by, and marriage itself to be undermined, by the inability of certain states to recognize other states' marriages. Um, and let's see. So that's kind of how rights can be fragmented, and institutions can assist in trying to, like the Supreme Court, when they are legitimized and seen as a co-equal branch of government, how the courts can help clarify and smooth out the bumps, and kind of enforce this consensus of recognized rights when there are. But the classic question is always, does the Supreme Court read the election returns? Do they pay attention more to politics, or just as much to politics as to the law? And the answer is probably yes. I'm sure that they do. They wouldn't be lawyers if they didn't also take in the social and cultural context. So rights themselves, how do they emerge? Well, frankly, through freedom of speech, through civil disobedience and public voice, that's talked about in chapter 42. Rights take on real meaning in public spaces through marches, through media, and through collective action. One thing that's mentioned in chapter 42 is the Montgomery bus boycott, to show how everyday public spaces, became a locus of resistance and constitutional change. And everyday public space, meaning the buses themselves, became a locus of a place to resist and bring about constitutional change. Education and the right to be heard is in chapter 49. And rights are all about inclusion, are also about inclusion in public dialogue, who gets heard and where. Hubert explores the school curriculum as a political battleground for inclusion of different histories, including those of indigenous peoples and African Americans. So school curriculum itself is often, as we know very well, in Virginia, is hotly contested between people who would rather include a lot of different, especially cultural histories within the curriculum, and those who would rather see that kind of thing shied away from, and bring it towards more of a shared history. So it can be very complicated, but it is also very important to note that the school curriculum is always a reflection of a political understanding. The question is how inclusive that political understanding is, or how exclusive it is, and which groups does it privilege some over others. So that is the real question to be looking at, is there a kind of recognition or celebration of privilege that occurs? And can we possibly be conscious of that? And how does that contribute to our shared understanding of our own institutions? The digital world also is now a major location for the exercise and regulation of rights, like freedom of speech, like freedom of assembly, like the right to privacy. And chapter 50 reflects on how protest movements have relied on social media, raising new challenges for free expression and surveillance. If you go to Media, Pennsylvania, you can see the COINTELPRO exhibit. the counterintelligence program that the FBI engaged in, where they were spying on leaders of protest movements like Martin Luther King Jr. And how J. Edgar Hoover and the founders of the FBI were intent on making sure that radicals were surveilled. And that ethic did not go away with the files of COINTELPRO being exposed to the world, or the death of J. Edgar Hoover. It certainly has continued, and a lot of leaders of very popular protest movements end up getting bugs on their phones and treated like enemies of the state when they are simply leading political or social protest movements. So people who really exercise their freedom of speech end up not having as much personal liberty. What other ongoing rights battles are there? One talking point is that abortion rights illustrate the geographic and jurisdictional nature of rights enforcement. So ever since Roe versus Wade, but certainly ever since the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022 with the Dobbs decision, we have definitely seen an uptick in the noticeability of how protected abortion is as a medical option for people in any of the 50 states. At this point, I don't know which states are I'm sure there's a map somewhere. Maybe I can pull that up for you in Canvas. So how many states have effectively banned abortion in almost all cases? And so the question is how something that was a right for 49 years is now essentially not a right in maybe most, or certainly at least a dozen states in the union where it's been outright banned altogether. Another one about rights is that rights can exist in principle but can be undercut in practice depending on local enforcement or opposition. So Chapter 69 talks about how some states have expanded transgender protections. States like California, for example, while others have passed bathroom bans or banned drag performances. So that's a question of how protected people of kind of transgender, people who are transgender, how protected have they been in the U.S. since some of these bans on using bathrooms they're more comfortable in, or banning drag performances. It really depends what state you're living in and whether the legislature has been able to pass any kind of ban or any kind of law that disadvantages that population or not. Finally, voting rights can be one way you can manifest what opinions, what rights are recognized, what rights are protected, and what rights are conferred by voting. So the right to vote is an excellent example of a right that technically exists everywhere, but is effectively restricted in many places. So you only have to look at, in Chapter 70, Hubert's explanation of voter ID laws that have been passed over the last 2 decades, purges of voter rolls that have taken place in many states, and reduced polling sites that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. And look, this is one way I always like to pose this to my students is that it's not really about the individual calculus of how difficult it is to vote. Voting is a numbers game. Voting is an attempt by political forces to win power. And whether or not you win power, there was a consensus, at least from 1965 until maybe 1990, that during that time period where I happen to come of age. Um, During that time period, there was a consensus that if you just made sure it was um, accessible for everyone to vote, then it was just a matter of mobilizing your people to vote more and try to persuade as much of those people who are voting that they're on your side, that they should vote for you. Now, it has become much more of a numbers game to not just mobilize your people, and definitely not to persuade, but to mobilize your people and to almost explicitly do things that will demobilize your opponents. So that is a sea change in political culture that has definitely occurred. And voter ID laws 100% affect marginalized communities more than majority communities. And marginalized communities, not that any one individual is so disadvantaged by not being able to vote, it's a minor inconvenience at best. But when you make it difficult for, let's say you make it as difficult for everybody, you do one thing that makes it more difficult for everybody, that will affect marginalized people the most. Because marginalized people are the ones who are most economically disadvantaged and most socially disadvantaged, and voting is way low on everybody's priority list. But if you can prioritize it and you're politically aware and politically conscious and you have the time and the energy and the resources to be able to participate in politics, you're going to vote easily. Um, but if it's not a priority for you, or you don't, you're not educated enough, or you are educated enough, but you simply cannot make the time, there's going to be more people at the bottom of the economic and social ladder that just give up. That even if some people don't, the majority will, or at least a large portion will. So if you make it more difficult for people in a marginalized community to vote by closing polling places, for example, in marginalized communities, and make kind of cram people into really crowded polling places so that they have to stand online for 8 hours at a time, that line isn't going to last 8 hours. People are going to go home. So it's a numbers game that no longer is there a consensus around. It's a numbers game that has become a contested site of politics. No longer where politics happens. It's a battlefield. So it's no longer, yeah, another way to say it is it's no longer you know the, the kind of level playing field. It's an attempt to explicitly de-level the playing field so that one level is higher than the other. So I look forward to your questions about where we locate our rights in Module C. Some of you may have already written them, and maybe many of you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.